No burgers on July 4th. No steaks on the Barbie. I'm sure Middle America is just going to love that.
The false story started last week, a day after the UK tabloid, the Daily Mail, published an article that claimed President Biden's climate plans could limit Americans to one hamburger a month. Former Trump White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow blasted Biden's climate goals as anti-beef. Kudlow and the Daily Mail article both cited a University of Michigan study.
Speaking of stupid, there's a study coming out of the University of Michigan which says that to meet the Biden Green New Deal targets, America has to, get this, America has to stop eating meat, stop eating poultry, fish, seafood, eggs, dairy, and animal-based fats.
But that is not what the study said. It actually found that reducing red meat intake could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was never tied to Biden's climate plans.
They want to control your transportation. They want to control your food.
But the article and Kudlow's outrage set off a right-wing media frenzy. The misinformation spread to online news sites and people's Facebook feeds. Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott and lawmakers even posted about it, falsely claiming Biden wanted to severely limit red meat. Amid criticism, Fox News issued a clarification about their reporting.
The data was accurate, but a graphic and a script incorrectly implied that it was part of Biden's plan for dealing with climate change. That is not the case.
The beef whopper shows how misinformation can quickly spread and take hold in the current political climate.
Canceling Dr. Seuss isn't stupid, it's intentional.
It's similar to the conservative uproar over the false stories of Dr. Seuss being quote-unquote canceled, when the book's publisher simply said it would stop printing several Seuss books with racist depictions. Now, to discuss what that study actually said about our diets and greenhouse gas emissions, I'm joined by Martin Heller. He's one of the authors of the study and is a senior research specialist at the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan. Dr. Heller, welcome to the NewsHour, and thank you for making the time. I have to ask, when you saw this story spreading, when you saw that it was linked to your study, what was your initial reaction?
Disbelief, befuddlement. Yes, you know, it was a long ways from our intention with the study. We certainly were not aiming to look at policy recommendations with this particular study.
And what was your intention with the study? Let's separate fact from fiction here. What did your study actually say?
Sure. Well, really, we were just looking to demonstrate the opportunity there is in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from making shifts in our diet. So we looked at a number of hypothetical scenarios. What if we reduced our animal-based food consumption by 50% in the US? What would that mean for our greenhouse gas emissions? And we did an additional scenario. What if we reduced our beef consumption to 90%, took that even farther? And what we found was that reducing our animal-based food consumption by 50% can lower our greenhouse gas emissions from our diet, from producing that food, by 36%. If we take beef down to that very low level, 90% lower than our current consumption, it would cut our emissions from food production in half.
So you were essentially evaluating different scenarios of what could possibly happen. But to be clear, did any part of your study say that Americans should stop eating red meat?
Not at all, no. You know, again, we're presenting the opportunity, and yes, it was not intended to be a recommendation. These are fairly extreme scenarios, I would say, you know, largely to demonstrate those opportunities.
So let me ask you to explain the science a little bit here. In terms of the link between greenhouse gas emissions and our diet, specifically Americans' diets around red meat, what should we know about that? What is the environmental footprint of our current meat consumption?
Producing animals contributes greenhouse gas emissions in a few ways. One big part is growing the feed that is required for those animals. And animals like cattle, like beef cattle, require a lot of feed to offer a unit of food that we can then consume. Those ruminant animals, like beef cattle, have an additional impact in that their biology, the biology that allows them to get nutrients from roughages like grass, as a byproduct produces methane. And we know methane to be a very potent greenhouse gas. So that is a major contributor to the emissions associated with animal-based food. Just to put it in perspective a little bit, red meat, so beef, pork, and lamb represents 9% of our calories in the average US diet. It represents 47% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our diet. That's those three, and beef is 40% of the emissions associated with our diet. So beef is a big contributor here in the US where we consume such large quantities of it.
Dr. Howell, let me ask you, because you grew up on a livestock farm, we should point out, what do you make of the way this whole conversation has unfolded, the life it's taken on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important conversation for us to be having. I find it's a bit unfortunate that the conversation gets pushed to such extremes, because as we're demonstrating here, there are real opportunities in, relatively moderate changes in our diet in contributing to this climate crisis that we're currently a part of, in contributing to the solution to that climate crisis.
That is Dr. Martin Heller of the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
The red meat conspiracy is just one of a number of myths circulating on the internet about President Biden's policies, including related to the pandemic. Here to explain how these falsehoods spread and how to counteract them is Graham Brookie. He's the director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. Graham Brookie, welcome back to the NewsHour. Thanks for making the time. The evolution of this one red meat story, right, where it starts with a piece of information, it's misrepresented, it's packaged as false claims, and then takes off online and in some media circles. Is this part of a pattern now? Have we seen this before with other issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is part of a wider pattern of mis and disinformation, domestic mis and disinformation that we're seeing accelerate for sure here in the United States. One of the interesting things about this case of misinformation about whether or not we're all going to be able to eat beef here in the near future is particularly interesting. One of the main promoters or influencers or amplifiers of this was Congressperson Lauren Boebert. What is interesting is that she has a significant constituency that is a ranching constituency. And so this case in particular is false. We will all be able to eat red meat. But it's interesting in that it's literally and figuratively red meat conspiracy theories for her political strategy.
And one of the places we saw some of those claims being amplified was, of course, on Fox News. There's a clip I want to play from you from host Tucker Carlson, because there's this other piece we've seen in the explosion of misinformation online is the sort of brandishing of information as cultural warfare. We're talking during a pandemic. Masking has become a political issue. Last night on Fox News, host Tucker Carlson weighed in on mask wearing in public, and he said this.
Your response when you see children wearing masks as they play should be no different from your response to seeing someone beat a kid in Walmart. Call the police immediately. Contact Child Protective Services. Keep calling until someone arrives. What you're looking at is abuse. It's child abuse.
Graham, someone like Tucker Carlson, with an audience of his size, making a statement like that, likening it to child abuse, what's the impact of a statement like that?
Well, Tucker Carlson has a nightly viewership of millions of people. And so first and foremost, that statement is false. Second, we're in the middle of a public health crisis in which the information that we need to make decisions about our own personal health is evolving. And so today, the CDC guidelines on masks evolved, it changed. It means that we have new guidance, and that's to be expected until this pandemic is over. It is not over yet. And so this information is less about getting the evidence right and more about signaling to an audience. And so when Tucker Carlson has stories like this, it's less about journalism and more about ideology and amplifying that ideology to a very significant amount of people across the United States.
Specific to Fox News, though, just to bring it back to that red meat story we talked about earlier, they did come out and then say, we're walking this back. Our script implied something that was not, in fact, true. What's the impact of something like that? Once the information is out there, once the misinformation is out there, coming back to correct it later?
Right. Well, the myth is always going to be reach more people. The original falsehood is always going to reach more people than the correction. And that's the ballgame here. Whenever you have a false narrative that gains a certain amount of traction, it will reach more people than all of the work that it takes to correct that falsehood or reach all of the people that the falsehood had originally reached. And that continues to be a major vulnerability during our public health response to the ongoing pandemic.
When you're talking about things that are said, it's also now we're looking at the real world implications of that misinformation and disinformation. There's an example that caught a lot of people's attention out of Florida. There's a private school in Miami where the head of the school sent out a letter basically discouraging faculty and staff from getting vaccinated against COVID-19, saying that she wasn't sure that COVID injections are safe and that if faculty get them, they can't be around students. That is, we should say, in the face of the CDC, FDA, World Health Organization, all saying the vaccines are safe. But Graham, once an idea like that makes its way out into the real world, what can be done to combat it?
Well, we have to correct it, and we all have a role to play. Everybody kind of thinks as disinformation as somebody else's problem, and where we have cases like the unverified narratives that are spread by Tucker Carlson, that's a structural issue. We're going to have policies to deal with that and create resilience against that. But on a day-to-day basis in our own lives, we have a responsibility to address misinformation or unverified information, especially when it affects our day-to-day lives. And so the first and best practice in this case is always refer back to, or at least look for, publicly accountable science-based sources. And in this case, nationally, we have coronavirus.gov that's run by the CDC. It's updated every single day with the latest guidance. But in local cases in which the situation might be slightly different from one neighborhood to another or one town to another, the first and best practice is to refer to your local public health officials.
So, Graham, a lot of these examples we're talking about are generated in right-leaning media circles and outlets. Are there comparable examples coming from the left?
Well, I mean, one of the main points is that disinformation and misinformation is not always ideological. That said, what we've seen with public health misinformation about coronavirus is that the scale and scope from far-right ecosystems in the United States is far greater and has far greater amplification and infrastructure and engagement than sources of misinformation or instances of misinformation or unverified information from other ends of the ideological spectrum. And so that's a long way of saying where Fox News exists by an entire ecosystem and has a lot of amplification and reach, that doesn't necessarily exist for types of misinformation from other ideological ends of the spectrum in the United States at this point.
Graham Brookie helping us sort fact from fiction, joining us from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Thanks, Graham. Good to see you.
Thank you.